All right, strap yourselves in because today we're going deep on a case that's truly unsettling. The story of the Otaku Murderer. Now that nickname, it might sound like something straight out of a manga thriller, you know, but the truth is this was a real person.
Oh, yeah.
Committed horrific crimes in Japan back in the late 1980s.
That's a fascinating one.
His name was Tsutomu Miyazaki, and his case, well, it sent shockwaves through Japan,
Definitely.
sparked a cultural panic that's it's still felt today.
Absolutely.
What's especially fascinating and disturbing is how this case, it got all intertwined with otaku culture,
Yeah,
a term we'll unpack as we go.
that's right. It's a case that forces us to confront some really uncomfortable questions about mental illness and social isolation and the influence of media all within, a rapidly changing cultural landscape.
Okay, so let's start by kind of painting a picture of Miyazaki's early life.
Hmm.
On the surface, he wasn't exactly what you'd picture for someone who would commit these kinds of crimes.
Right.
He was born in 1962 into a wealthy, influential family in Tokyo.
Yeah.
But as with many of these stories, there's a lot more beneath the surface.
Absolutely. Miyazaki was born with a physical deformity called radial synostosis,
Okay.
which means the bones in his forearms were fused, making his hands appear claw-like.
Oh, wow.
It's not hard to imagine the impact that had on him growing up.
Yeah, I can only imagine the bullying and the feeling of being different, especially in a culture that can be very appearance conscious.
Exactly. He faced constant ostracization from his peers, and what's even more tragic is that this isolation, it kind of extended to his family as well. His father was a distant workaholic, and while his mother tried to compensate with material possessions, there was a clear lack of emotional connection.
That's so heartbreaking. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound wounds are inflicted within the family unit, even in seemingly, well-off homes.
Yes, and this lack of a stable emotional foundation is often a key factor in understanding how individuals like Miyazaki become so detached from societal norms and develop, such distorted worldviews.
So how did this early trauma manifest as he got older? Did he act out or was he more withdrawn?
He became increasingly reclusive and sought solace in fantasy worlds, immersing himself in anime and manga and horror movies and pornography. Now, it's critical to note that countless people enjoy these forms of entertainment without becoming violent.
Right. It would be ridiculous and harmful to suggest that everyone who enjoys those things is a potential criminal.
Precisely. But in Miyazaki's case, it appears these obsessions became his primary coping mechanism, further blurring the lines between fantasy and reality. It's this kind of extreme escapism that investigators later focused on, trying to, unravel the link between his media consumption and his horrific crimes.
Okay, so let's talk about those crimes.
Mhm.
Between 1988 and 1989, he abducted and murdered 4 young girls, the youngest being just 4 years old.
And the details of these crimes are deeply disturbing. What particularly chilling is the evidence of ritualistic behavior and the psychological torment he inflicted on the victims' families.
Right? It wasn't just the murders themselves. It was the deliberate cruelty, the almost theatrical staging of some of the crime scenes. He would take trophies from the victims and even send letters and packages to their families. Can you give us some examples? I know some of our listeners might find this tough to hear, but it's important to understand the full scope of his depravity.
You're right, it is important context. For example, after killing 4-year-old Erica Numba, he sent her family a postcard with a message assembled from words cut out of magazines. It read, Erica, cold, cough, throat, rest, death.
God, that is just horrifying. I can't even imagine the pain and terror those families went through.
And in another case, he actually sent a box containing the ashes, bones, teeth, and clothing of a victim to her family. It was a calculated act of cruelty designed to maximize their suffering.
It's truly monstrous.
Mm-hmm.
So with all this horrific evidence, how did they finally catch him? Was it good police work, or was it more a case of him slipping up?
It was a bit of both, actually. The police were under immense pressure to find the perpetrator. They had very few leads, but they were diligently following every possible avenue and distributing, thousands of posters.
But as meticulous as a criminal might be, there's always a chance of a mistake, right?
Always. And for Miyazaki, it seems his need to control and exert power ultimately led to his capture.
So he got careless.
In a way, yes. He became bolder in his attempts to abduct young girls. In July 1989, while attempting to take explicit photographs of a girl in a park, he was confronted by her father.
Wow, that's incredible. A father's instinct kicking in at the most crucial moment.
Indeed. There was a struggle, and Miyazaki managed to escape. But instead of fleeing, he later returned to the park to retrieve his car.
Really?
That's where the police, alerted by the father, were waiting for him.
What a dumb move.
It's often said that arrogance is a criminal's undoing.
That certainly seems to be the case here. So they arrest him.
Yeah.
What happens next? What do they find when they search his apartment?
Remember we talked about his obsessive media consumption? Well, prepare yourself, because this is where things get really unsettling. The police uncovered over 5,763 videotapes in his apartment.
Whoa, that's a lot of tapes, even for a serious movie buff. What was on them?
Some were anime and horror films, as you might expect, but many others were home videos, videos of his victims, along with photographs and other macabre evidence.
It paints a vivid and disturbing picture of his inner world, doesn't it?
It does. And this evidence, along with his confession, would become central to what would become one of Japan's most controversial trials.
And a trial that would last for 7 years. Why so long? Was it a battle of legal titans?
It was more than just a legal battle. It was a clash of ideologies and perspectives on criminal responsibility and the role of mental illness. The prosecution argued that Miyazaki was fully aware of his actions and deserved the death penalty, but the defense took a different route, didn't they?
They did. But before we get into the complexities of the trial and the cultural fallout, I think we need to unpack one more crucial element of Miyazaki's psyche, his Ratman alter ego.
Yes. That's essential to understanding his defense strategy and the broader debate surrounding his culpability.
Okay, so let's dive into that now.
So before we get into the trial itself, let's explore this Ratman persona.
Okay.
During his trial, Miyazaki claimed that this alter ego, which he even drew in court, forced him to commit these heinous acts.
It's a bizarre detail that adds another layer of complexity to this already disturbing case.
Right.
What was the reaction to this Ratman defense? Was it seen as a genuine delusion or a calculated legal tactic or something in between?
That's the question that captivated the public and divided expert opinions.
Yeah.
Some psychologists suggested it could be a manifestation of dissociative identity disorder,
Okay.
where an individual develops distinct personalities, often as a coping mechanism for trauma.
Right.
But remember, DIZ was a relatively new and controversial diagnosis at the time.
And its role in criminal behavior was hotly debated.
So there was skepticism about whether this Ratman was real or a convenient way for Miyazaki to deflect responsibility.
Yeah.
Did the prosecution challenge this defense?
Absolutely. They argued that Miyazaki was highly intelligent and manipulative,
Okay.
suggesting he was using the Ratman as a ploy to feign insanity and escape the death penalty.
Interesting.
They pointed to the meticulously planned nature of his crimes and the chilling letters he sent to the victims' families as evidence of his awareness and intent.
So the prosecution believed he was fully in control, while the defense argued he was driven by a fragmented psyche.
Right.
That must have made for a fascinating courtroom drama.
Oh, definitely.
Can you walk us through some of the key moments of the trial itself? What were some of the most compelling arguments presented by each side?
Well, imagine the courtroom, packed with journalists, legal experts, and members of the public,
Yeah.
all eager to witness the unfolding drama of the Otaku Murderer trial.
The stakes couldn't be higher. A man's life hung in the balance, and the outcome had the potential to shape cultural attitudes towards mental health and media consumption in Japan.
It sounds like one of those landmark cases that everyone remembers where they were when the verdict came down.
Yeah.
So how did the prosecution build their case?
They focused on the meticulous planning and execution of Miyazaki's crimes.
Okay.
They highlighted his methodical approach to selecting and abducting his victims, often choosing girls who lived in relatively secluded areas. They also emphasized the chilling letters and packages he sent to the families,
Right.
arguing these were deliberate acts of cruelty designed to inflict maximum psychological pain.
So they were painting a picture of him as a calculating, cold-blooded predator rather than someone driven by uncontrollable urges or delusions.
Exactly.
Did they bring up his otaku interests as part of their case?
They did, but they had to tread carefully.
Right.
They couldn't outright say that his interest in anime, manga, or horror films caused him to become a murderer. That would be like saying everyone who enjoys violent movies is a potential killer, which is obviously absurd.
Right. It's important to avoid those kinds of generalizations and scapegoating.
Exactly. But they did present evidence of his vast collection of violent and disturbing media,
Okay.
suggesting it might have desensitized him to violence and fueled his fantasies.
Yeah.
Remember those thousands of videotapes they found in his apartment? Many contained graphic content, including some that documented his own crimes.
That's incredibly disturbing. It speaks to a level of detachment and a blurring of boundaries between fantasy and reality that's hard to comprehend.
It is, and the prosecution used this evidence to argue that Miyazaki was capable of distinguishing right from wrong, even if his perception of reality was distorted.
Okay, so the prosecution presented a compelling case for premeditation and awareness. What strategy did the defense use to counter this?
The defense team focused heavily on Miyazaki's psychological state,
Oh.
arguing that his troubled childhood, social isolation, and potential mental illnesses diminished his culpability. They brought in expert witnesses who presented conflicting diagnoses, including schizophrenia, dissociative identity disorder, and personality disorders.
So they were trying to raise reasonable doubt about his capacity to understand the gravity of his actions.
Precisely. They argued that his obsessive media consumption, coupled with his mental instability, created a dangerous cocktail that led him down a path of delusion and violence.
Right.
Remember the Ratman persona? They argued this was more than just a legal tactic.
Right?
It was a manifestation of his fractured psyche, a way for him to compartmentalize his horrific acts and distance himself from responsibility.
It's a classic insanity defense, isn't it? Trying to convince the jury that the defendant was not in control of their actions, at least not fully.
Yes, and it often hinges on convincing the jury that the defendant's mental state was so impaired that they couldn't appreciate the wrongfulness of their actions.
That's a tough sell, especially in a case as horrific as this one. How did the public react to these conflicting narratives?
Public opinion was deeply divided, reflecting the complex and often contradictory feelings surrounding the case.
Yeah.
Some people were convinced of Miyazaki's guilt and demanded the death penalty, viewing his crimes as unforgivable acts of evil.
Right.
Others were more sympathetic to the defense's arguments, recognizing the potential role of mental illness and social isolation in his descent into darkness.
It's a classic dilemma, isn't it? Trying to balance the need for justice with the understanding that mental illness can be a significant factor in criminal behavior.
It is.
How did the judge and jury navigate these competing narratives?
It was a long and arduous process, with both sides presenting compelling evidence and expert testimony.
I can imagine.
Remember, this trial lasted 7 years.
Yeah.
And it involved a tremendous amount of legal wranglings, psychological evaluations, and media scrutiny.
Oh, wow.
It was a case that gripped the nation and forced people to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil, the limits of personal responsibility, and the role of society in protecting its most vulnerable members.
7 years is a long time.
It is.
So much could have changed in the cultural landscape during that time.
Absolutely.
It must have been difficult for the jury to remain impartial with all the media attention and public debate surrounding the case.
You're absolutely right. The media coverage was intense, and it often sensationalized the more gruesome aspects of the case.
Right.
This undoubtedly influenced public perception and potentially even the legal proceedings.
Yeah.
It was a case that pushed the boundaries of the Japanese legal system and highlighted the challenges of balancing individual rights with public safety in a rapidly evolving society.
So after all this back and forth, after years of legal battles and public debate, what was the final verdict? So after all this back and forth, after years of legal battles and public debate, what was the final verdict?
Well, in 1997, the Tokyo District Court, they found Tsutomu Miyazaki guilty on all charges.
Oh.
They rejected the insanity defense, arguing that he was aware of the nature and consequences of his actions, and he was sentenced to death.
It's hard to imagine what must have been going through his mind at that moment.
Oh, absolutely. The verdict, it sent shockwaves through Japan, and it reignited that whole debate about the role of mental illness in criminal behavior. Miyazaki's defense team, they immediately filed appeals, arguing that the court had failed to adequately consider the impact of his psychological disorders. However, both the Tokyo High Court and the Supreme Court of Justice, they upheld the original verdict.
So essentially it was over for him at that point.
Yeah.
What happened next?
Miyazaki, he spent nearly 2 decades on death row before being executed by hanging in 2008.
It's a long time to sit with that knowledge.
Oh, definitely. In his case, it remained a source of fascination and controversy long after his death. It raised those profound questions about the nature of evil, the limits of human understanding, and the responsibilities of society to address mental health issues.
And as we've discussed throughout this deep dive, it also had a profound impact on Japanese society, particularly on the otaku community. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, Miyazaki's crimes and the media frenzy that surrounded them, it created this climate of fear and suspicion around otaku culture. Remember, this was a time when anime, manga, and video games, they were gaining mainstream popularity in Japan.
Right, he was becoming a significant part of youth culture.
Exactly. And suddenly, this vibrant subculture was being demonized in the public eye.
Wow.
People who enjoyed these forms of entertainment, they were stereotyped as social misfits, potential deviants, or worse. It was a classic example of moral panic, where society latches onto a scapegoat to explain, complex and frightening events.
It's a shame because it unfairly stigmatized a whole community of people who were simply passionate about their interests. It's like blaming rock music for juvenile delinquency back in the 1950s or video games for violence today.
Exactly. It's a recurring pattern throughout history. When confronted with something we don't understand or find unsettling, we often look for easy answers and convenient targets to blame. And unfortunately, in this case, it was the otaku community that bore the brunt of the backlash.
So how did this impact the otaku community in the long term? Did this stigma ever fade?
That's a complex question. While the initial waves of panic it eventually subsided, the stigma hasn't entirely disappeared. There's still a lingering association in some circles between otaku culture and, social awkwardness, isolation, and even potential violence. And this perception, it's had a chilling effect on some fans, making them hesitant to openly express their interests for fear of judgment or discrimination.
It's a reminder of how powerful media narratives can be and how important it is to be, critical consumers of information. We can't allow fear and prejudice to dictate how we understand entire groups of people.
Absolutely. It's essential to challenge stereotypes and to recognize that individual actions don't reflect the values or behaviors of an entire community. The vast majority of people who enjoy anime, manga, or video games are law-abiding citizens who pose no threat to society.
It's crucial to remember that. So beyond the impact on the otaku community, did Miyazaki's case lead to any broader societal changes in Japan? Did it spark any reforms or policy shifts?
It did. Miyazaki's crimes, along with a few other high-profile cases in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they prompted a national conversation about crime prevention and the need for better mental health services. It led to stricter child protection laws, increased investment in mental health resources, and greater awareness of the signs of social isolation and potential risk factors for violent behavior.
That's at least one positive outcome from this horrific tragedy. It's often said that even in the darkest of times, there can be glimmers of hope.
There can. And it's through confronting our greatest challenges that we sometimes find the strength and the will to make positive changes. Miyazaki's case, it was a wake-up call for Japanese society. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about the vulnerabilities within their communities and to take action to create a safer and more supportive environment for everyone.
It's a powerful lesson that resonates far beyond the borders of Japan. It reminds us that we all have a role to play in building a more just and compassionate society.
I couldn't agree more. By understanding the complex factors that contribute to tragedies like this one, we can work together to prevent future horrors and foster a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and supported.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the unsettling case of Tsutomu Miyazaki. It's been a journey through the darkest corners of the human psyche, but it's also been a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and our capacity for growth and understanding.
Indeed. It's a case that challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, to question our assumptions, and to work towards a future where tragedies like this are less likely to occur.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration. We hope it's left you with more questions than answers and inspired you to continue exploring the complexities of the human condition.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.